Virginia Heckert is curator in the Department of Photographs at the J. Paul Getty Museum. Since joining the curatorial staff at the Getty in 2005, she has organized 12 exhibitions, including In Focus Ed Ruscha, In Focus Los Angeles, Lionel Feininger Photographs, 1928 to 1939, Urban Panoramas, Opie Liao Kim, Irving Penn Small Trades, August Sander, People of the 20th Century, and Bont and Hilla Becher, Basic Forms. In addition to publications on Ruscha and Irving Penn that accompanied exhibitions of the work, she is the author of Some Aesthetic Decisions, The Photographs of Judy Fiskin, and Albert Renger Patch, Photographs from the Museum Folkwang. She is currently working on a publication that considers 7 contemporary photographers concerned with process-based photography, which will be released in spring 2015 and will accompany an exhibition here at the Getty. Previously, she was curator of photography at the Norton Museum of Art in West Palm Beach, Florida. She received her PhD in art history from Columbia University in 1999 with a dissertation on the work of the fine German modernist photographer Albert Renger Patch. She's also my boss, so please give her a round of applause and welcome panel 3.
Thank you, Amanda, for your excellent introductions today. Did I just hear you got a raise? So, you have made it to the third panel from the Rearview Mirror, Critical Perspectives on Photography in LA. And today we have 4 panelists, each of whom I'm going to introduce, and then we will begin a conversation. I won't introduce them alphabetically or chronologically as before. I'll just point to them as I introduce. So first we have Rebecca Morse, who completed her master's degree in art history at the University of Arizona in 1997 with a thesis on photographer Robert Huntington, Alain Robbe-Grillet, and montage. Shortly thereafter, she began working at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, MoCA, and in her role as associate curator at MoCA from 2009 to 2013, she organized the following exhibitions: Florian Meyer-Eichen, The Artists' Museum, Rodarte, States of Matter, Tsai Guo Chang, Ladder to the Sky, and Amanda Ross Ho, Teeny Tiny Woman. She also introduced works by important Los Angeles-based artists and educators into the collection, including Robert Heineken and Walid Beshti. Since February 2013, she has been associate curator in the Wallace Annenberg photography department at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where she curated the recently opened exhibition from the collection titled Night in Day, and is organizing the exhibition Larry Sultan, Here and Home, for fall 2014. She also established the new support group titled Lens, Photography Council, about which we will be hearing more. Jennifer Watts, to my far right, your far left, is curator of photographs at the Huntington Library Art Collections and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California, where she has worked since 1991, overseeing a collection of approximately 1 million images. Her exhibitions and co-authored publications related to historic and contemporary photography of California and the American West include The Great Wide Open, Panoramic Photographs of the American West, which she curated with Claudia Bond-Spector, Edward Weston, A Legacy, and This Side of Paradise, Body and Landscape in Los Angeles Photographs, again co-curated with Claudia Bond-Spector, and which produced this publication. She is also editing and contributing author to the 2012 publication Maynard L. Parker, Modern Photography and the American Dream, about the life and career of this notable 20th century architectural and garden photographer. Her 2012 exhibition, A Strange and Fearful Interest, Death, Mourning, and Memory in the American Civil War, was drawn exclusively from the Huntington Library's extensive Civil War holdings. A forthcoming exhibition will explore the work of American photographers Bruce Davidson and Paul Caponegro in Britain and Ireland within the context of their journeys to these overseas locales. The show will open at the Yale Center for British Art next month before traveling to the Huntington in November. Jan de Bont, to my immediate right, is a film director and producer who began his career in Holland. He moved to Los Angeles in 1976 and founded Blue Tulip Productions. He has worked as a director of photography on numerous successful movies. As a cinematographer, his visual style is characterized by a constantly moving camera and the use of handheld cameras. He made his directorial debut in 1994 with the film Speed, which was followed by Twister, The Haunting, Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, The Cradle of Life, and others. As a producer, he has been associated with films SLC Punk and Minority Report. Together with his wife, Trish, he has built an extensive collection that emphasizes early and mid-20th century American photography, including holdings by Edward Weston, Harry Callahan, and Robert Frank, that they have generously loaned for exhibitions here at the Getty Museum. The de Bonts also have rich holdings of European modernist photographers such as André Cartege and Pierre Dubray. Their collection includes excellent examples of work by Eastern European masters František Drýdekol, Jaromír Funke, Josef Sudek, as well as holdings by figures associated with subjektive photography such as Otto Steinert. They also collect contemporary photography with works by Gregory Crutzen, Thomas Demand, James Welling, and Matthew Brandt, among their more recent acquisitions. Christopher Knight, third from my right, has been art critic at the Los Angeles Times since 1989. He is a 3-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism in 1991, 2001, and 2007. In 1997, he received the Frank Jewett Mather Award for Distinction in Art Criticism from the College Art Association, the first journalist to win the award in more than 25 years. While writing his dissertation on Robert Smithson at the State University of New York in Binghamton, Christopher applied for a curatorial position at the San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art and has lived in Southern California ever since. He has also served as Assistant Director for Public Information at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and as art critic at the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner for 10 years. He has contributed essays to numerous exhibition catalogs and is the author of 2 books, Art of the 60s and 70s, the Panza Collection, published in 1989 with a second edition in 2003, and Last Chance for Eden, Selected Art Criticism, 1979 to 1994. Christopher holds a master's degree in art history from the State University of New York at Binghamton and an honorary doctorate from Atlantic College of Art. So enough of the introductions. Gary Winogrand famously said, "I photograph to see what the world looks like in photographs." In a conversation with Patricia Milder of the Brooklyn Rail in 2011, Christopher Knight noted, "I write about art in order to find out what I think." Since the members of this panel represent such a diverse range of involvement with the arts, I thought it would be interesting to begin asking each one of you why you do what you do and why you do it in Los Angeles. Why do you write about art? Why do you organize exhibitions? Why do you collect photographs? And why don't we begin with you, Christopher?
I write about art in order to find out what I think. And I'm fortunate enough to get paid to do that, which is really sort of remarkable these days. The first time I ever set foot in Los Angeles was in 1976. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, had never really been west of Toledo, Ohio, or maybe Chicago at that time. And I was coming out for an interview in San Diego, and I remember getting off the airplane at LAX and just immediately feeling like I was at home, which puzzled me for a while until I realized that the reason it felt so much like home was that I had lived here through images my entire life. I was born in 1950, so I'm a child of television and picture press and movies and all of that. And the landscape, the environment, the place was a place of pictures and felt like home. Before before coming here for this symposium, one of the things I did in thinking about images and Los Angeles in particular was to look up in the archives of the Los Angeles Times what the very first photograph published in the newspaper was. And it was published on December 8th, 1898, and it's a photograph, just a sort of blurry photograph, of an enormous plume of black smoke. It's a picture of a fire. There was an explosion in gas tanks, Standard Oil gas tanks in East LA, which is what the picture recorded. And I was sort of struck by the fact that here, encapsulated in this first image that was sort of publicly disseminated as a photograph in the city, in many respects became the standard cliche of Los Angeles, paradise exploding, the disaster of the perfect environment. And in looking at that photograph and the time in which it was made, it also occurred to me that Los Angeles at that point was a very, very small town. Population in the 1890s in Los Angeles was about 50,000. Population doubled over the course of that decade to about 100,000. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, New York City, the population was 3.5 million. The population in Chicago was 1.7 million. Los Angeles was a small town whose history, whose entire trajectory is commensurate with the proliferation of images. So the idea of Los Angeles as a place, the self-image of Los Angeles as a place, is bound up in camera images in a way that other major cities in the United States are not. New York and Chicago had identities when photography began to proliferate in the public sphere. And I think, since in a prior panel there was the inevitable conversation about differences between LA and New York, I think one thing that is significant about that relationship between camera imagery and Los Angeles is that through most of that history of the 20th century, camera work was, artistically speaking, a second-class citizen. People have spoken about how there were very few galleries, there was no market, there was, the most famous photographer in the country would be known by about 25 people and so on. And it's because photography had this kind of second-class status. And that second-class status has also been overlaid on the city of LA artistically. The cliche is, Los Angeles doesn't really have a culture except for yogurt. When in fact it has an incredible culture that came through camera work, camera lenses. And it wasn't until there was a change in camera status vis-a-vis art that I think we began to see this. So that's a long answer to your question of why.
Thank you. It's much
here.
longer than what's written on the screen, but thank you. And Jan, you came to Los Angeles that very same year, 1976, for camera images of a different nature in the film industry.
Yeah, actually, I originally wanted to be a photographer, and I started making pictures. But then, I started thinking much more about the moment that when I took those pictures, what happened before, what happened after, and how come it doesn't move? And I got so bored with non-moving pictures that I thought I go to film, and because that's where I feel life is only in motion. You cannot really perceive a character's face if there's not some kind of motion in it. And then I started to photographing many movies. And when I came here, I was, of course, very familiar with the European photographers. And when I started reading about photography here, I felt like a little bit put down, because there were a lot of those chief curators of museums, they told you what to like and what not to like, and they made those kind of rules. That's good and that's not good, and I quite often didn't agree with them. And especially in the bigger museums, especially in New York, there was this pressure, like you should only buy this, only buy that. And of course, we started to think, no, that's not good for us. I want to do what I want to collect, and what my wife wants to collect. And basically, we started to direct our own little museum collection, a mini one. And the first picture I collected was one of Edward Weston, which, of course, I knew about in Holland, but I had never really held one in my hand. And since when I saw the picture and I was allowed to pick it up and look around, and actually, the back is as important quite often as the front. And I started thinking, this is absolutely fantastic. Now, this is really, really something that that is the one focus we should get. Start with Edward Weston and then see where it leads you. And very quickly, our interest started to spread to a lot of other American artists, but all the time I knew I had to go back to European photography as well, because there was so many great things there that were hardly ever seen here or not paid any attention to. And so now our collection is, I would say, half European, half American photographers.
So the part of the question why you collect photographs.
Oh, why?
I'm sort of curious between the connection of being dissatisfied with still photographs that you took by yourself versus building a collection with your wife, Trish, and constantly having that collection grow and change and the pictures moving on the walls of your home.
Yeah, it is like, we never thought, initially we had a smaller house, and then ultimately the house became too small for the pictures. So we had to move to a bigger house, and I was sure this was going to be big enough for the rest of our lives. And of course, after 10 years, 15, that house was way too small for all the pictures we had collected.
Well, but you certainly don't have the problem that Jenny has with 1 million photographs.
No, absolutely not. But what Trace and I like a lot is we like to be around our picture. We like to see them every day. That the experience when you walk your house and suddenly you recognize a picture that you hadn't looked at for a couple of weeks, and it is like so refreshing to look at it, in the evening or sometimes in the morning. Or it is fantastic to see it always a different light. And then what we also regularly do is we kind of move the pictures around a lot. And each time you hang a famous picture next to another one, it creates different values to it. And you start actually making connections that are so fantastic. And they become almost stronger pictures by making different combinations of artists.
Jenny, why do you do what you do?
Well, my story is a little similar to Christopher's in that I came out here in 1988 from New Jersey, suburban New Jersey, and I came out for graduate school, and I'd never visited. I had no intention of really living here other than coming out for grad school. And so when I arrived in 1988, I also had that similar feeling of being like, I feel like I know this place. It's sort of familiar, but yet utterly foreign. And through a series of kind of serendipitous events, I ended up at the Huntington and discovered that there was an incredible archive of photography. And because we were a library, primarily a library that focused on books and manuscripts, the photography collection had sort of been relegated to stepchild status. And so that gave me an opportunity to really start looking and discovering for myself. And what I discovered was that there was this immense, rich, deep collection of photography that depicted Los Angeles starting in the 1860s up to about the 1950s. And I think my first thought was, I've been sold a bill of goods, growing up on the East Coast and thinking that Los Angeles has no history and that it has no real visual history to speak of. And so, it was incredibly energizing and so exciting to discover these just incredible photographs, some by, people that we know well, those of us who study 19th century photography, like Carlton Watkins, and and others who were completely unknown. Some who were collected as artists, like Edward Weston, and others who were journeyman photographers or commercial photographers. So I could just sort of dive into this deep sea of imagery, and it was hugely exciting. And I thought, how do I bring this out and show people and have people get the same kind of excitement and intellectual stimulation that I have?
We're going to come back to some of those aspects of the collection that you've just touched upon, but let's get to Rebecca as our fourth person to answer the question.
Yeah, well, starting a little bit earlier, as a student, I became interested in photography and worked as a printer for sort of every summer job that I had. And then going into college, I thought I wanted to pursue being an artist, but didn't know that could be really a full-time pursuit for me. So chose a program where I could take art classes and also study art history. And so I went to SUNY Purchase, which was a school that really believed in living artists teaching their students. So my photo teachers were Greg Crudson and Jan Groover and John Cohen. And so that was my sort of training, both as an artist and then simultaneously taking art history classes. And then coming out of that, worked for a little bit as a commercial photographer, which, as you can imagine, sent me right back to school, where I then married the two very well and studied history of photography. But I think that background for me in making art, or trying to, and then discovering that there are so many people out there who were so much better at it and so much more interesting at it than I was. But I was always really excited about sort of talking to them, seeing what they were making, and then taking that into the museum context, which became my profession. Really believe in that opportunity that the institution can give a living artist, which is to examine their work differently, have an exhibition in which either it's commented on or organized by a curator, but then they have that opportunity to really grow from that experience of seeing their work. And so I think that's what has sort of fueled me, is that relationship with artists and working with them.
And that, again, we will hear a little bit more about, but it is interesting that both of your positions here in Los Angeles at the Museum of Contemporary Art and also at LACMA seem to really emphasize the contemporary artists and less so with the historical work. And all of you actually have described in some way how you came out here, well, not Rebecca perhaps, initially with one idea in mind, what you would do, and your careers or what you are doing now has shifted quite a bit. So that idea of the kind of changing landscape, particularly as it relates to photography in Los Angeles, leads me to another quote by Christopher. I don't know whether to call these Christopherisms or Knight-isms. A lot of LA's efflorescence as a cultural center can be summed up in one word that for decades was a slur: sprawl. Sprawl was supposedly this hideous, horrible, negative thing, and sprawl has turned out to be absolutely critical to the cultural success of LA because it is too big to gentrify. I think there's a second part here. I'll just let you read that on your own. But Christopher, and I'm curious, how does sprawl affect your work? I want to show one review, and this has come up already earlier today, that you wrote of the retrospective of John Davola's work, which was spread out in 3 different locations: Santa Barbara Museum of Art, Pomona College Museum of Art in Claremont, and Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And I believe that you said in order to see all 3 of those shows, you traveled 267 miles.
Yep. And I was happy to see all 3 parts, although looking at one photograph of John's and thinking, oh, I wonder what this has to do with, oh wait, I can't look at that other photograph because it's 80 miles away in the part 2 of the show. And that's a certain problem. But that distance, that travel, puts me in mind of something that was discussed in the last panel, which had to do with street photography. And part of the conversation had to do with how there isn't really this tradition of street photography in Los Angeles, which is something that I would disagree with. I think there's been a major revolution in street photography that came from LA. And it happened in the late 60s. There was also a conversation about about the significance of photography books in New York, which didn't really happen in Los Angeles. Well, this revolution in street photography happened in a photography book. And the book is Every Building on the Sunset Strip, Ed Ruscha's accordion fold, 26 feet. You probably know exactly how many feet.
Yes.
Accordion fold in which what Ed did was to mount an automatic camera on a tripod on the flatbed of a truck and drive up the Sunset Strip photographing and down the Sunset Strip photographing and then printing them all on this accordion fold book. And before then, every single street photograph in the entire history of photography was done by pedestrians. By photographers on their feet, holding a camera in their hands, taking pictures on the street. In Los Angeles, an automotive city, that made no sense. So Ed made a street photograph on wheels. Just that kind of mobility that then gets reflected in something like a John Davola show that you have to travel a couple hundred miles to see, is in some respects a norm here that doesn't exist in a lot of other places, and changes the experience one has of the relationship to a photograph.
And certainly how all of us have the opportunity to see gallery shows, museum exhibitions, because they are spread out all over the city. Are you able, I know we have Leah Ullman also here who writes for the Los Angeles Times, and you have your weekly review section, and how is it that you divide up who covers what and where and when?
The review column is done, reviews are typically not assigned. The reviews are done in a rotation. And there are 4 of us who do the Friday column, and when it's your week, it's entirely up to you. Whatever you want to choose, you choose. Whatever exhibition you respond to that you want to write about, you write about. And occasionally there'll be an assignment made if there's an unusually significant show for whatever reason that ought to be covered. Or we also try to cover the waterfront, since the galleries in Los Angeles are peripatetic and spread out. Someone was saying to me the other day, someone who's recently moved here said the other day, gee, I'm so surprised. It's exciting to see there's a lot of art galleries opening in downtown Los Angeles. And I thought, back in the 80s, there were about 40 galleries in Los Angeles, and they all disappeared. They all moved west, and now things are moving back. So I can't speak for the other writers, but what I do is when my week is up, I hit the road and I see shows, and when I get 4 of them that have interested me, I stop and I go home and I write because I want to find out what I think.
That's right. And is part of your effort to find out who the emerging young artists are, and visiting alternative spaces, new galleries? Is that something that you try to do?
Yeah, constantly. And it's in the 30 odd years, very odd years that I've been writing about art in Los Angeles, the transformation has been absolutely astounding. I can't keep up, and I gave up trying to keep up about 10 years ago. It used to be possible to do that. It's no longer possible. It's too big, which is great.
So you have to be selective, or perhaps subjective, in your choices of what to see. And that, we might say the same thing for the selection of artists that Rebecca, in her capacity as the sort of ringleader of the lens group at LACMA, the selection of artists that she makes there. And she's brought a couple of examples of work, and I'd like her, perhaps I'm going to give her the clicker and let her sprawl through the slides
Sure.
and perhaps tell us a little bit about the program.
I want to ask Christopher a quick
Okay.
question, though,
Okay.
before I go on. Do you like to follow an artist? If you review a show of theirs and then they have a show 2 years later, do you feel like that's an interesting opportunity to keep up with what they're doing? Or if another writer comes and says, I want to do this, I mean, how does that?
I mean, if there's an artist I'm interested in, I do like to follow that work and write about it multiple times. I'm more than happy if another critic comes up in the rotation and beats me to it and uses it. That's great, because there should be multiple points of view expressed about an artist's work.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, to segue into this new support group that we have at LACMA is called Lens, and it is really about where we are in Los Angeles, because it's based on emerging, and there's a varying scale of emerging that we use, artists who are working here. And Los Angeles affords us the ability to look at so many artists on all throughout the city at different points of their career. And so we go in as a group and do studio visits with them. And so we do 6 a year, and also hope to make acquisitions of that work. So we support them by visiting them and telling people about them, and then also bringing the work into the collection. So it's kind of twofold in that way. And so some of these artists you probably do know, others perhaps you do not, but this work is the work of Carter Mull, and he's an artist who works in photography, but also works in drawing as well. Early on in his career, he was shown at MoMA in the New Photography exhibition, and so from that point has been sort of deemed a photographer, for better or for worse. He often talks about this categorization and whether or not it works for him, and how it also contextualizes his own work going forward, because it is often collected by photography departments and then talked about in terms of other photographers. And he's not always interested in that conversation, but it's interesting how an artist can become sort of brought in a certain way, and then their work is sort of affected by that. And here you can see he's juxtaposing images of Jackson Pollock from the movie, the Ed Harris movie, and then there's also some images of women standing in front of Jackson Pollock paintings that were used for a 1951 version of Vogue magazine. And so he's interested in media and the way our ideas are sort of synthesized through media. This is the work of John Houck, and it's a little bit more personal. And he's an artist who is maybe just a few years out of getting his MFA at UCLA. And what you're seeing here, well, he's actually trained as a computer programmer and an architect, and came to photography through a computer program that he had written in order to determine a way of making an image, and sort of wrote this program to align different colors to make an image. This is a departure from that, and what you're seeing are a necklace that his parents gave him when they were cleaning out their house on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is where he grew up. And they systematically would send him these objects to his home in California, and so he would get these things and open them up. And I think some of us at a certain age have this experience when your parents say, okay, that stuff in the basement, that's yours or ours, or it's yours now. And so he was confronted with all of these objects from his childhood. And what he's done is he's made a photograph of them, printed that photograph, and then used that as a backdrop, and then put these objects on top of that photograph, photographed it again, and done that 3 or 4 times. So you have this unusual relationship to space and light, and you can't really tell what's up and what's down. Also another artist, Heather Rasmussen, who sort of another kind of personal investigation, formerly a ballet dancer. And what you're seeing there is a cast of her foot on point, which she discovered when her apartment caught on fire and she lost a lot of her personal effects. But this foot survived, and so she began making photographs of it. She had, at the time, when she made this cast, she had given up ballet for photography, and so there was a relationship between those two things. So it's about kind of the passage of time and her own body. And Kate Costello, also somebody who is working across media, which continues to interest me and really is something that I'm seeing, and we've talked about it throughout the day here, but more and more artists who make photographs, who make drawings, who make films, use photography in different ways. So she's primarily really a sculptor and a drawer, and she's made these amazing backdrops upon which she has posed models and using poses taken from paintings, and made these interesting photographs that really talk about the relationship to the muse in terms of painting versus photography. Oh.
Amanda.
Here I am in the world of time-based media, so transferring from still images and working out the mechanics of trying to figure out a moving image in a PowerPoint. So this is the work of Owen Kidd, and he's interested in this idea of durational photography. It shifts over time, and so he was interested in sort of the passage of time and this idea that a photographer might come in or this idea when you look at a photograph, it appears as if the photographer has just come in, taken this image, and disappeared, and that there's no relationship to the subject. And so he was interested in investigating this and made sort of long portraits of people who he met on the street. Those are up to a minute or 2 minutes. And I'm sorry this isn't playing for you, but I guess you can imagine that over time it changes in its coloration and also sort of reflections that are happening behind it. So that's just a handful of some of the artists who we visited over the course of this last year and made acquisitions for the collection.
You mentioned that there are sort of various phases of emerging, and one of them was included in a new photography show at MoMA. But how do you learn about the others, those who perhaps have not yet had gallery shows?
Yeah, one of the best ways for me to learn about new and emerging artists is to ask the artists who I visit who they recommend that I go and see. Because they have, a whole handful of friends who they're in connection with or who they went to school with. And, now more than ever, people are going to school here and staying here. And so that really builds. And I do a lot of studio visits, I think on average about 3 a month. So that's, almost 1 a week. And a combination of going to studios and then people also coming to the offices at LACMA because we have a big space and open up and look at work.
So, and Jan, you and Trish have been turning your attention increasingly to contemporary photography. Do you do studio visits? Do you go to the open studios of graduate students as they're showing their work, their thesis projects? Or is it through galleries, art fairs? How do you learn about the work?
Well, actually, I don't like to visit studios too much. I think I don't want to know anything about it. I don't want to know how they were made. I feel like I want to judge for myself how much I like it. And then, but I ultimately, before we ever buy something, I feel like I have to go there and see it myself. I can never look at a screen or at a catalog or a book and then determine this is the picture I want to have. Ultimately, then you will go through a process how to acquire this specific picture. And because it might be in Berlin, it might be in Paris, it might be somewhere else in the world, and then you have to start this whole system where how you can acquire it at one point.
Well, that's an interesting aspect of sprawl that goes well beyond the boundaries of Los Angeles.
But I want to say something about Los Angeles because I think that if for any young collector right now, there couldn't be a better time to live in LA and collect LA artists. I think there's some of the best work right now comes from Los Angeles, the most exciting. And that brought me actually again to collecting modern contemporary art and some of the people are here actually today. So I completely agree that this is like the way to go. And I think for young artists, you can still afford those pictures now. If you're going to buy like a Stieglitz or a Man Ray, an early Man Ray, then it's going to cost you a fortune. So you have to really, for a starter collector, this is the perfect place to be right now in Los Angeles.
So, Rebecca, you previously worked at MoCA, and we were talking a little bit about how photographs entered the collection there. You made some acquisitions of Huntington, whose work you were familiar with, having written your master's thesis on it. But what other ways might photographs have entered that collection? And specifically photographs by LA-based artists? I guess
Well-
I'm asking in conjunction with exhibitions,
Yeah.
because as,
Oh, okay.
as Jan is saying, it's always important to see the work, although I know that you do sometimes buy at auction.
Yeah, but
And
then I know ahead of time that's the one I want to see, and even then I have to go to the auction house to take it out of the frame and look at it. And if you can't do that, I think you're taking a gigantic risk, because whatever a book photo promises, or a print or a screen, that might not necessarily reflect the real quality of a picture. Sometimes you have to really, you can make a big mistake, I'm trying to say. So you don't want to buy a picture that's $100,000 and you see it's like, oh shit, this is really not that good as they said it was.
Well, I'm actually reminded of Anne's panel, the students who were asked to write on paintings at the Met, and some of them, well, they all wrote on the same paintings, which they found on the internet. That was good enough for them.
So, that's not a good thing to do. I would not recommend that.
So Rebecca, you
Right,
were...
yeah, no, so one of the strategies when I was there was to collect objects out of exhibitions that were held at the museum. So we acquired John Davola's work out of Under the Big Black Sun, also Eileen Segalov's work out of that exhibition, Valley Export's work out of WAC, because, I mean, not only to support those artists, but the work had been done by organizing that exhibition and bringing together what we thought was the most excellent. And why not, if we could have the funds to do so, bring that into the collection as a lasting entity.
And that reminds me, if I may take the clicker,
Yes.
that perhaps a similar strategy was used for This Side of Paradise, which is a show that Jenny organized at the Huntington Library and Christopher wrote about. We learned, and this applies to the idea of sprawl as well, that it included 284 photographs by 108 named makers, as well as a number of anonymous or unknown makers. And the show was organized with several themes, 7 actually: garden, dwell, move, work, play, clash, and dream. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the show, the installation, and perhaps whether works from that collection, that works from that exhibition then entered the collection?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I had, as I mentioned earlier, because I'd been immersed in this kind of historic material, I began to really think about doing an exhibition around it. And then I teamed up with an excellent independent curator, Claudia Bont, and we started talking about how this would go. And I love working with artists. I love working with contemporary artists. And so we said, well, why don't we just do the whole shebang? Why don't we go from, the 1860s to 2008 and really look at the whole sweep of image making in this city and look at some of the themes that emerge. And, I had seen some really strong and very resonant themes in the 19th century, early 20th century work that I've been looking at. And so that opened us up to really start visiting a lot of artists and talking to a lot of artists who really made it their practice to be in the city, to think about the city, making work in the city, not just people that had kind of breezed through, although, we did have Robert Frank and others, but really people that made their careers here, so many of whom are here today or were on the earlier panels. So, and that was just really illuminating on many levels. So, I could just keep naming names. I mean, Robert Flick, Joanne Callis, Eileen Cowan, Daryl Curran. So we got to see sort of all the people that have been really rooted here, and we were able to acquire some of the work for the collection, but we're a really strong research-based collection, so we have to really, almost by mandate, collect in depth. So it wasn't enough for me to just get 1 or 2 works by an artist, although we did get some of that. But really, I view this as an opportunity to build around the core of the Huntington's historic collection and have people start also making connections on their own. And that's why we also decided not to do a kind of a chronological sweep, because I personally find that somewhat stultifying as a curator and not the most enlivening approach. So we also had the challenge of how do you mount a show of 280 works in a gallery space that is just walls, and really get that sense of openness, that kind of horizontal landscape that we think of when we think of Los Angeles. and we worked with a very talented architectural team that's based here in Los Angeles, Daly Genick firm. And after many iterations, kind of came up with this construct of having, and this was many iterations down the road, but of putting these works on this kind of armature, so that it allowed us, just from a pragmatic viewpoint, to get a lot more work in the gallery space. But it also allowed us to have views through the gallery, to be able to make visual connections and juxtapositions. And also, in a weird way, sometimes you don't really realize things until you begin installing. I don't know how you feel, Rebecca, but suddenly my moments, kind of the light bulb moments come. And as I was walking through the gallery, I realized, this is just this wonderful sense of movement through the space, akin to what we feel when we're driving through the space in Los Angeles, where you're kind of seeing signage, you're seeing billboards, you're kind of navigating through the space. So this was the kind of installation that we did, which I felt quite pleased with at the end of the day.
Again, sticking with this idea of sprawl in Los Angeles, I want to apply that to the vastness of the Huntington's collection, 1 million images that you oversee. That's quite a job. And you provided some slides, and much like with Rebecca, I'm going to give you the clicker so that you can tell us a little bit about some of the aspects of the collection at the Huntington.
Okay. We'll see what I can't remember the sequence here, but... okay, so yes, as Virginia's noted, it's a very large and vast collection. But I would say the primary emphasis is on California and the American West, which is really what is relevant for the American history part of our collections, the later part. And one of the archives that we acquired was this is the Julius Shulman. I like to say this is the Julius Shulman no one's ever heard of. Maynard Parker, the kind of middle-class modernism guy, he, like Julius, although more so, worked for the major shelter magazines of the post-war era. So he began here in the 30s and worked through the 60s, and his principal client was House Beautiful. So he was really capturing this whole kind of sun-kissed aesthetic, I like to say, of the indoor-outdoor living. This is a wonderful shot. This is this highly staged view with the two owners of the Bircher Share House, a Harwell Hamilton Harris architectural gem, which is still intact. And this archive is about 58,000 images, and we've scanned a number of them. They're available on our website. And I did do a book. I don't know if that's not here, but I did do a book, and there are more books to come. I think this is in here because this really shows, this is the Edward Curtis 22-volume set of the North American Indian, and the reason this is in here is because Huntington only had really two interests that dovetailed with photography. One was Native Americans, and the other was the American Civil War. So he was one of the first subscribers to the North American Indian Project, which was underwritten by J.P. Morgan. So we very fortunately have all 22 volumes and the additional gravures. And we also have just vast collections of Native American imagery based on Huntington's interests, starting again in the 1860s and through the 20s. And we right now have a project to catalog all those collections and digitize them. I'm working with a talented team to do that. This is a very famous Matthew Brady shot, or that's Matthew Brady overlooking the wheat field at Gettysburg. And this, again, was one of Huntington's other abiding interests, and therefore we have stellar, really one of the greatest collections in the country. That's because Huntington was so rich that during his lifetime he would go in and buy entire auction catalogs on block. And during his lifetime he purchased two major collections related to Abraham Lincoln and the development of Gettysburg. So he went in and bought thousands and thousands of books, and what came with that was photographs. We also have, and this is kind of a funny story, one of the great vintage print collections of Edward Weston. Edward Weston was the first photographer to receive a Guggenheim grant in 1937. In 1939, after the renewal of the grant, he began to think what he was going to do with all the negatives that he'd produced, and someone at the Guggenheim Foundation recommended the Huntington. as the perfect place to put this work. The Huntington was interested, but they didn't want to pay for it. So Mr. Huntington drove a hard bargain. So essentially, they bought materials for him. So for $1.50 a print, Edward Weston printed 500 vintage prints for the Huntington, which were primarily his Guggenheim work and then his Whitman trip, which came after the Guggenheim trip. But he threw in some of the early and most amazing still lifes, including this shell. The interesting thing is that when the Huntington, sort of grudgingly actually, decided to take it, they said, well, no nudes, please, no nudes. We don't want nudes in the collection. And we're seeing this as pure visual documentation of California and the West. And so that's really why we collected it, was these were documents. This is how the early
$1.50 a bargain.
documents, yes, this is how the early librarians saw this.
Maybe you should try the trick.
And then finally, we do, and this was also part of the LA show, we do collect contemporary work. So, you know, my collection does go from the advent of photography with the pencil of nature through to the present, but we do it with building to the strength within the collection. I'm very interested in the work of women photographers that have been working, have kind of a longer tradition in the landscape. And Karen Halverson is one example, Lori Brown is another, but we're doing it in a limited way.
And one more slide.
One more slide. Yeah. Oh, yes, okay, and then this is our latest acquisition, which you probably have seen in the news, because it was on the front page of the Los Angeles Times digital edition. What I didn't realize, I guess I should have, is that once something's on the front page of the digital edition of the Los Angeles Times, every newspaper in the world picks it up and recycles it over and over and over. So I've been getting calls from Mumbai and other places about this collection. But this is the collection of Ernest Marquez, who collected for 50 years the early imagery of Santa Monica. It's about a 5,000 item collection, so it runs from about the 1860s to the 1950s with incredibly just incredible, not just historical gems, but his aesthetic gems, because Ernest has an eye. So coming soon on our digital website.
Okay, thank you. And so we have our next Christopherism. Peter Sheldal once said something about museums, which I thought was very perceptive. He hates museums. He said the only reason to go to museums is because that's where they keep the art. They're ridiculous places, but they've got the stuff. So, does that mean you hate museums as well?
I used to be a curator, but I'm no longer a curator. No, I don't hate museums. Partially because that's where they keep the stuff. I think it was in the second panel. There was a question from the audience about the kind of gap from around 1974 to the early 80s in terms of what exactly was going on with photography in Los Angeles. And part of the answer, I mean, the question was what caused the change in the 80s that began to bring things to the foreground? And part of the answer is the institutionalization of photography, which is what museums do. One of the primary moments in this turn has to do with where we're sitting right now, and that was
I paid him to say this.
when J. Paul Getty's will came out of probate. And suddenly, Los Angeles, which had no identification as an artistic center, cultural center, much of anywhere else, began to be identified as this potentially major place for art. And on the heels of that resolution of the will came the announcement that the Museum of Contemporary Art was going to be built, that the LA County Museum of Art was going to build what was then called the Anderson Building for modern art. Suddenly there was this efflorescence of institutions who that were going to be identified with works of art, including photographs. So the development of any cultural consciousness, artistic consciousness, outside of small networks in universities, colleges, studios, and so on, happens in museums, which is significant. At the other end of that spectrum, the question about what happened in 1974, where where things seem to have dropped off, is sort of the flip side of J. Paul Getty's vast wealth, and that is that there was an enormous recession in the economy in the United States, and the minuscule institutions, the places like the LA Institute of Contemporary Art and the Pasadena Art Museum and places like that, were no longer sustainable because the money disappeared and the galleries disappeared. And it didn't mean that artists and photographers were no longer working, didn't mean that the universities closed, but it does mean that the public profile went way, way down because of the economy.
So you've mentioned the Getty Museum, which in addition to the museum, the Research Institute also collects photographs, the Huntington Library as the primary repository for photographs, but also art collections, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Hammer Museum, and now the Annenberg Space for Photography. That's a pretty rich array of institutions that show photographs. And in fact, I believe it was in a review, I don't know, but just last fall being noted as a particularly rich opportunity to look at photographs here in Los Angeles, with monographic shows on Jim Welling at the Hammer, John Davola in 3 locations, and at Abelardo Morel at the Getty, collection shows, See the Light, the Vernon collection at LACMA, At the Window, The Photographer's View, and In Focus Architecture at the Getty, and The Power of Photography, National Geographic, 125 Years at the Annenberg. That's really a rich array of offerings for Los Angeles. Does that make LA a good place not only to study photography, but to see photography, in your opinions, as collectors, critics, and curators?
I think it's a great thing. I think it's like one of the reasons I love LA so much, because when people ask me, do you really like LA? I say, yeah, there's so much to see. And it's mainly because of the museums. Because our interest is so much in photography, I mean, not only, but it is amazing that you can see completely different shows, 10 minutes, sometimes an hour apart, and that of art that you will never get a chance to see any other place. So I think it's fantastic, and I think it will only grow. I think that LA is such a city based on visuals. The film industry for almost over 100 years have created most of the images in Los Angeles, and that is in people's mind. They recognize the city in every movie. Oh, that was there. That was the La Brea. And it is really great to see that. But what is also fantastic, I think, is the explosion of digital cameras on cell phones, etc. That makes almost everybody an artist. But then also, it's a really great teaching tool, because making 5,000 pictures on the cell phone doesn't mean you make one good picture, and most of them are unwatchable.
Well, let's ask John. How many of those 5,000 were good pictures by your daughter? Where is he?
But what I think what does happen is that the people who make those pictures starting to realize that it is actually quite difficult to make a really good picture, and they start therefore more to appreciate art photographers and look at their work. Oh wow, this is really, really great. And so to me, I think the development of all this new technology is a positive thing, and it also helps museums even now, because I think that if you have kids going to a museum and you give them a little camera and you ask them to make pictures around the museum and see and at the end they'll look at it and they see this like nothing comes even close ever, it will tell you ultimately that it's very hard work to become a good photographer. And
Rebecca, I think, learned that.
That's right, exactly. Personally. I also think it's interesting how over the course of these years that we're talking about, how each of these institutions has really honed their personalities, and maybe it has something to do a little bit with social media in a way, and sort of having to put forward what they perceive their personalities to be or how they want them to be interpreted. But I think you might say, oh, I'll go to the Getty and see this, and I'll go to the Hammer and see this, and it's not like cut and dry, but I think as each of our institutions grows, it's important to kind of hone that, and it offers such a great range, I think, for viewers.
And sometimes you don't even have to go to the museum.
That's right.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to say for me working in an archive, this has been just the most exciting time one can imagine, because the technology now has allowed us to do things very versatilely and in a way that we just couldn't before. So this is an example where this is part of the Pacific Standard Time, the second phase, the architecture phase, and we got a collection from the Southern California Edison Corporation. It was 80,000 images. We scanned each and every one, thanks to Edison. And I was really struck, because I had to spend 2 years spot checking all those for quality, how I had one idea of what that archive was going to be, and I thought it was very much going to be about power poles and transmission lines, and of course it was. But
very exciting.
Yeah, very thrilling. The poor photographer that had to scan all these 80,000. But so a couple of things. One is this is purely a negative collection. So before we had this kind of digital technology, this would have been almost impossible to make available at this scale. But really what I realized as I was looking through it was this is about better living through electricity. That's what Edison was documenting. And I was immediately struck with this project that it reminded me so much of the Larry Sultan, Mike Mandel evidence project, right? This is actually, for those of you who know that famous Lee Friedlander image, Los Angeles 1964, with the palm trees in the window and the cutout. This is from the Edison archive in 1961, one of the Edison photographers, and I couldn't get over the similarities here. But at any rate, the Getty allowed us, and this was put forward by two scholars, to bring together 20-some I guess it was a few less than that. 20 people, curators, artists, writers, thinkers, historians, to pick 35 images out of the collection and to curate a little exhibition, an online exhibition, and to write text to accompany it. So everything from Kathy Opie, who wrote this incredible story about landscape, I think was hers, to DJ Waldy, who wrote a fictional account based on the images called Noir, which he then narrated. I did something on archive, but you can see the range of kind of topics that people chose and the range of images. And for me, this was just a revelation to be able to take this one corporate archive that had been created for one particular purpose, and to have 20 really creative people and thinkers reimagine it in all sorts of different ways, and then put it on the web for others to riff off of, was just kind of a dream come true, actually.
Cool.
It actually does sound that way. And I love that idea of having artists come in and interact with an archive or actual works of art. And I do want to clarify something that came up a little earlier. When Jim Welling said that he spent most of his time, Jim, are you still out there, preferring to look at photographs in books? It's not entirely true. He has brought his classes to the Getty Museum. We have a study room, and we encourage professors, instructors of both photo history, art history, and studio art classes to bring their students to the study room by prior appointment, and we pull out photographs and they actually look at them. So it's a great learning experience, and it sounds like this is another opportunity to refresh or to enliven a collection of images with insights from others. Creative thinkers, creative observers. I think that was the idea that somebody brought up earlier today about being a good photographer is not necessarily about being creative, but about being open to observation. Yeah. We have been told that we are nearing the end of our session here, and so I don't know if there are some other issues that you would. I know Christopher said he might want to bring up things that I'm not asking. So have I neglected to give you the opportunity to talk about something you're dying to talk about?
No, but I do have something else that I could say. One thing that I've also been aware of today over the course of these 3 sessions is that of all the panelists, I'm sort of the cultural tourist of the group. There are artists who make photographs. There are curators who archive and display photographs and research photographs and do scholarly work with photographs, and collectors who collect photographs. I'm not a photography-obsessed person. What I do is look at photographs.
What makes you think all of us are photo obsessed?
Wait. Well, I think obsession is like terrific. I'm a big fan of obsession.
The movie.
But given what I do, I look at, write about, and think about paintings and sculptures and performances and prints and drawings and photographs as well. And one of the biggest changes has been something I alluded to earlier, and that is the ghetto is gone. The photography ghetto is gone. Photography used to be really a second-class citizen, and that is no longer the case. And there are artists who identify themselves as photographers. There are artists who don't identify themselves as photographers, even though they make photographs and so on. And I think that's all to the good. It's a kind of post-Warhol universe where when you look at Warhol's work from 1962 to 1968, virtually every painting he made is essentially a photograph masquerading as a painting, because photography was second class and painting was first class. So it occurred to me when we were looking at Zoe Leonard's postcards of Niagara Falls. There's a lot of sources to those Niagara images from American art and American culture and American history, but one of the primary sources is Warhol. Not by accident was the Marilyn Monroe photograph a still photograph from the film Niagara, which is the movie that made her a star. So, anyhow.
Okay, Niagara isn't LA, but that's okay. We'll let that one slip.
Can I say one more?
Yeah, and then we're going to open it up to questions.
There's one thing that always has bothered me as a collector, is that as the years go by, and especially in modern days, the prints tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I start to wonder if those new artists, the younger artists, are actually making their pictures only for museums and galleries, or they still have a world of mind where people can actually acquire the pictures and hang them at home. Because what they do by making those big prints, you basically have to take 8 other pictures from the wall to hang theirs, and that is kind of elimination by force, I would think. And I think it's something to think about, to remain interesting to collectors by not making those gigantic overscale prints.
So this is a suggestion for all the artists out there from a potential collector. All right, so do we have questions from the audience? I see a hand way up there, Stephen White.
Yes, thank you. I feel I have to defend the non-existent period between 1974 and 1984.
Yay!
Thank you. There was no giant vacuum cleaner that swept up every photograph in Los Angeles and redeposited them when the Getty opened. There were a group of people who had galleries, both profit and non-profit, though most of them were not profit at the time. There were people working in criticism, teaching. Robert Huntington used to bring his students around. There were people starting to collect, and it was a very risky business at the time. But basically, there were a whole group of people who were working very hard to establish photography as a collectible and important art form. In 1979, a group of us consisted of collectors, dealers, and even Alan Jutzy from the Huntington Library, came together and started a museum without walls. We got nonprofit status. We did 2 exhibitions, one at the LA County Museum on photography from 1900 to 1965, which was curated by our own Leland Rice, who's still somewhere here, hopefully. And the second one was put together by John Humble, who came to us and wanted to do a survey of Los Angeles and brought in many of the photographers you've heard talk today. We did that exhibition on a grant from the NEA. It was shown at Mount St. Mary's College. Camera, which was still operating then in Switzerland, did an entire issue on this group and on LA photography in 1980. And that then traveled to another museum, I can't remember where. But by the time the Getty and the other museums started to develop, there had been a tradition of photography in Los Angeles established by a group of people working very hard together. Susan Spiritus, G. Ray Hawkins, LACPS, LACE, all these people were involved in making photography and building the foundation for what's there today, and we're all happy to see it where it is. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And I do want to say that some of the not-for-profit institutions were named earlier, but you are absolutely correct that we did not represent galleries in any of our sessions today. And the work that you, G. Ray, Susan Spiritus did was indeed essential. Jim Welling had a great idea for an exhibition. Any takers here? With the title, The Lost Decade. And Stephen, I believe that you are working on a history of this period. Is that correct? Okay, so we will eagerly await that. Are there any other questions? Oh, one way up above. I don't know how we can do that. Okay.
Since we have 3 of the curators from the major institutions, I want to see if you could address conscious collaborations or the ranges of niche collecting in your collections. It strikes me in a way that we have recent things such as the dual Maplethorpe acquisition, or even online currently the Getty and the Huntington are doing something on Tumblr where they're sort of doing a before and after series of photos from their collections, whereas, I don't know, 10 years ago, it doesn't strike me that that really existed in the same way. But beyond that, to what degree do you discuss collecting, consciously think about what you should collect? Do you contact a fellow or your cohort at a different institution saying this might be better for you, and so on?
I mean, I guess I'll tackle that first. I think that's a great question. We were just talking about it yesterday about the fact that we are all very collegial and don't feel necessarily competitive. I mean, I've really been more in the kind of underworld of special collections. So we've all collaborated, and so I certainly am offered things quite frequently that I say, this isn't a good fit for us, but why don't you try the Japanese American National Museum and or the Getty and whatnot. So, but I think that, I'll let my colleagues speak here. I mean, I think that that's something that as resources get tighter, as not just in terms of money, but in terms of staffing resources, this is a way that I think is a really fundamentally smart way to think about doing bigger, more elaborate exhibitions that you couldn't do in-house.
Well, I would say on an almost daily basis that we get collections, works offered to us. And sometimes it's very easy to say this is not appropriate for the museum's collection. We pass it on to the Getty Research Institute. And that is usually in the case where there are quite large archives or sort of including ephemera, negatives, etc. But sometimes it's not appropriate there either. And as Jenny says, we try to be helpful in terms of directing or redirecting an offer elsewhere. When we do make acquisitions of work that we feel are works that we feel are important for our collection, that do fit in with our collection, we always check what is in the other local collections, some of which is online, some of which requires a phone call to the colleague at another institution. But we do not want to duplicate what is in an institution just down the road. I think that's, and there have been some opportunities and are some opportunities in the future for us to collaborate a little bit more with a sort of consciousness in mind. The Mapplethorpe came about because there were two directors, actually a director at the LA County Museum and a president here at the Getty, who were very interested in making that happen. So that's a large part of the equation too. You need the people who, at the top of the administration, who believe that collaboration of that kind is a very good thing, especially in a collection as complex and as rich and large as and expensive as the Mapplethorpe acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways Pacific Standard Time kind of created this idea about coming together and sharing information in a way that maybe we didn't previously. So I think we all are starting to do that more regularly and more often.
Question here first, and then afterwards the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then here.
I just wanted to tag on to Stephen, and I think that maybe calling it the pioneering decade might be a little more respectful than the lost decade. There, in addition to all of the names that have been mentioned today, I wanted to point out Soho Camera Works, for which many of us started our cognizance of exhibitions, how to present our work, how to put up an exhibition without bleeding too much as you put the nails into the walls, that were part of a national, at that time period, of membership galleries that started in New York and worked its way across the United States to Los Angeles. That gallery was directed by Herbert Dufine, and many of us remember that gallery with a lot of fondness. The second thing that I just wanted to point out very quickly, from nonprofit to profit, another interesting, inspiring event during that period were the early auctions by Christie's and Sotheby's, and we would go to these auctions. I remember standing in the back of Sotheby's or Christie's with Gary Winograd, and we would look at each other and go, that just sold for $500, you know, and it was just incomprehensible to us. And that was another place to see prints and to see early photographs. So I just wanted to add on to this history that we've been talking about today.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And let's see, we had the gentleman with the blue shirt here, and then afterwards Rose. And those may be the last two questions we can take.
I guess I had sort of an observation and then would form it into a question for maybe all of you. I thought that as we watched all three panels today, that the first two seemed to really focus a lot on the past, specifically the 70s came up a lot, I feel like. And for the most part, I think that you guys have like really addressed what's happening today, you know, the most so far, or maybe an idea of where things are going. And one thing that it made me think of is that there's no artists on this panel, and so like maybe artists aren't the best ones to say. Like one of my favorite quotes is by Terry Allen, and he said that talking about art is like trying to French kiss through a telephone. And so I wonder if it's because artists are very focused on what they're doing in their own projects at that time, that they're not looking out at a wider range, or if you think that maybe what artists have to say is less important now, and that more of the emphasis on where things are going is based on acquisitions and more financially driven, which would, the point about the large prints, like why do the prints all have to be so large, and that I guess made me think of prints in general, like that it could be on some sort of screen. So like it seems like it's very, very based on like acquisitions.
I'm not sure that, well, I'm going to start that sentence all over again. Certainly, we do believe that artists have quite a lot to say about what is happening in the art world, in the world of their profession today. The first panel was really geared towards education and the fact that there is a rich tradition of education here in Los Angeles. And so perhaps we spent a lot more time than we thought would be spent in looking back to the past. But I think it was very interesting on the second panel to have the voice of someone like Matthew Brandt, who is a recent graduate of UCLA, the MFA program, having studied with Jim Welling, who was on panel 1, and then Alex Prager, who is a local photographer, is also based here in Los Angeles and feels that she got her education by viewing exhibitions here in Los Angeles. So I think maybe all of you will agree that this just happens to be the way the conversations went in the panels, but I don't know that we have, I don't think that the emphasis was supposed to be in this panel about how museums and acquisition policies determine the way artists should be working today, if that's what I understand your question to have been.
I don't think that we have anything to say about that. I mean, thank God, no. I think it's like, but you can be, you want to be surprised. You want to be, every time there's a new exhibition, you can't wait to see what's there, what they're doing now. And my comment about the size is only if you're a collector and it is so big, what are you going to do with it? No, that's a different attitude. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't make those big pictures. Of course they do, because there are locations where you can exhibit them. And so I'm not saying they never should do that, but it is. I think no collector will ever tell, or no curator will ever tell an artist what to do or how much to ask for a picture either. That's completely separated.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question here. Yes.
So I'm just going to echo, because Stephen White and Loretta as well raised the same issue that I was going to raise, which is one thing I want to say, extremely enjoyable to have been here today and listening to all 3 panels and the questions. And I think it was Joanne Callis who first mentioned, well, wait a minute, I was shown at G. Ray Hawkins Gallery in the 70s. And then Ann Tucker brought up, García Iturbide, Manuel Veras Bravo. I won't mention who represents them and who showed them before the Getty exhibited them. Alex Prager, Eggleston was exhibited at a certain gallery before the Getty exhibited. Julian Schulman at Craig Kroll's gallery. We have Matthew Brand here at Yoshimilo's and well, let's stay with Los Angeles and M&B Gallery. So only to say that there's a little segment of a conversation missing here, and I think it's a really important segment because there aren't too many of my colleagues here today, but perhaps on another symposium, we can speak about what we do to bring artists from all over the world, including artists from Los Angeles, to our galleries, not always for profit, many times non-profit, and do it to present work that has not previously been presented and to bring a new audience to these artists' works. So that's for another time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, I do agree with you completely that we would have loved to have represented that aspect of the landscape for photography here in Los Angeles with the galleries. We wanted to keep our panels focused, but next time galleries will be tops on the list because you do contribute a really important aspect.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That's the end of this session, and we are almost at the end. Amanda is relieved of her introductory remarks, and I get to introduce our last speaker, Judith Keller joined the Getty Museum as associate curator in 1986 and has served as senior curator since 2010. She has organized more than 24 exhibitions at the Getty Museum, including Nadar, Warhol, Paris, New York, William Eggleston and the Color Tradition, Strange Days, photographs by Gary Winogrand, William Eggleston, and Deanne Arbus, Where We Live, photographs of America from the Berman Collection, which inaugurated the Center for Photographs in the West Pavilion in 2006, Joanne Callis, Woman Twirling, and Japan's Modern Divide, the photographs of Hiroshi Hamaya and Kensuke Yamamoto. In addition to catalogs that accompanied many of these exhibitions, she has authored publications that highlight the Getty Museum's strong holdings of work by Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Ouija, and Milton Rogovin. Over the course of the last 5 years, Judy has led the department's efforts to expand the collection to include photographs from East Asia, including works by artists from China, Japan, and Korea. She is currently working on an exhibition in the context of Pacific Standard Time 2, LA, that will highlight Latin American photography. Finally, along with Weston Neff, founding curator of the Department of Photographs, she spearheaded the formation of the Getty Museum's Photographs Council, the GMPC, which, as we know, has supported and helped to organize this symposium. So thank you to the GMPC, and welcome to Judy for her closing remarks on this symposium, The View from Here, LA and Photography.
It's been a long day, but a great one, I think, in terms of conversations and lectures. I think that the consensus of opinion is that photography is very much alive and well. Its demise is not imminent, as people have been saying, especially on the web, I think, lately. Since I have been here, believe me, I'm only going to take a few minutes, so you'll be able to go out and toast the 175th birthday of photography very soon. But since I've been here since '86 and was around in 1989 for the sesquicentennial, the 150th birthday of photography, I thought I would just point out a few notes having to do with the history of photography here in LA for the last 25 years. I'd like to bring up, first of all, that in the summer of 1989, the year of the sesquicentennial, Robert Heineken was included in a group show at New York's Museum of Modern Art entitled California Photography Remaking Make-Believe. It was organized by MoMA curator Susan Kuzmarek, and the show included 7 photographers, including John Baldassari, Nancy Barton, Joanne Callis, John Davola, who were with us today, Larry Johnson, and Larry Sultan. I'm looking for water, so that's, there's some around someplace, I'm sure. But 25 years later, meaning right now, this spring and summer, there is a Heineken retrospective going on, his first, albeit posthumous, at MoMA. It's called Object Matter. And I think that it's one of the indications that things have changed, although not nearly as fast as we might have hoped. The Getty's Photographs Department and collection were founded by Weston Neff in 1984, as has been mentioned several times by people. In 1989, we mounted a series of 5 shows on the history of photography to celebrate the sesquicentennial. We had started doing shows in a 1-gallery space given to us at the Villa in 1986, and we have done since then 130 exhibitions. The size and number of our shows has increased greatly since moving to the Center for Photographs here. Another milestone event in 1989 was the arrival of the mythical Kathy Opie, who we had hoped would be with us today, but is, I hope, recovering quickly from her illness. She joined the UCLA faculty in 1994, and I think Jim would agree that things have not been the same since then, nor the same for any of us. She is such a huge presence in the photography scene. In 1990, Robert Zobiesek, a highly respected curator for many years at one of the oldest photography museums, the George Eastman House, was hired by LACMA. This was a big event. Robert told reporters at the time that he was lured to Los Angeles because it was evolving into a national center of photography, with prominent collections forming at such local venues as the J. Paul Getty Museum and the Huntington Library art galleries. Writing in the LA Times after Robert's passing in the summer of 2005, Elaine Wu recalled, "His hiring at LACMA was a signal to others in the photography curatorial world that the museum was ready to step up its efforts at building a more robust collection." Roberts threw himself into the community and his role at LACMA. He and assistant Tim Ride would mount a show of 66 Los Angeles County photographers in 1995 under the title Photography in Los Angeles Now. I'm going to reach for some water. A very positive atmosphere existed here in the 1990s. Edmund Teskey, Robert Heineken, who's been mentioned over and over again today, and Alan Sekula were still among us and very much a part of the activity, though Mr. Teskey was in his 80s by that time. These artists were already legendary here for their innovations in the practice and theory of photography, as well as for their teaching. In 1991, LA suddenly had its own photography fair. Photo LA was founded, I believe, by Steve Cohen, one of the early gallerists here. It became more and more international as the years went by. However, in 2014, this year, between January and May, there were 4 photography fairs held in LA, one of them run by a French company. New photography galleries were also established in the 90s. Among them, the Gallery of Contemporary Photography, now the Rose Gallery, opened in 1991. Steve Cohen opened a gallery officially in 1992, and the Luisati Gallery opened in 1995 at Bergamot Station. They joined David Fahey, G. Ray Hawkins, Jan Kestner, and Stephen White in the business of promoting the photographic art in LA. Much has changed in the past 2 decades. We actually show color photographs in our galleries here at the Getty, for instance. That started around the year 2000. The local collections have expanded continually. The comprehensive Vernon collection landed at LACMA in 2008. And at the Getty Center, as has been mentioned, I think the LA architectural photographer Julius Schulman, his entire archive was acquired by the Research Institute. And the 1980s icon New York photographer Robert Mapplethorpe was acquired jointly by us and LACMA. We're now planning joint exhibitions and a publication on Mapplethorpe. Los Angeles photographers are recognized regularly in this city with museum shows. This year, seeing an especially intense time of activity with Jim Welling at the Hammer, John Davola everywhere, and the MoMA Heineken show is arriving at the Hammer in the fall. Los Angeles photographic artists are also now recognized outside of LA more and more, even those who the East Coast establishment has found most challenging. In reviewing a new acquisitions in photography exhibition at MoMA last summer, in his Daily Beast blog, the writer Blake Gopnik highlighted the LA artist, the only one among the group who are being shown, Alan Sekula, and the project he completed in 1995, Fish Story. Gottnick exclaimed in his piece, Sekula's project, shot between 1988 and 1995, represents the informative, content-focused end of the spectrum of fine art photography. So it's great to see it find a home in a museum thought of as the home of formalist modernism. He went on to reminisce that when he first saw Sekula's images, they seemed utterly resistant to aesthetic concerns. They were just pure documentation of global trade and labor. Now they look like an established, familiar aesthetic. So it seems that the East Coast critics everywhere have finally caught up with what has been going on in LA for the past 25 years. And by the way, it was the Santa Monica Museum of Art that did show Alan's Fish Story right after it was finished in 1996. So today we've learned a great deal more about what's going on currently in Los Angeles in photography, the changes that have taken place in the way photography is taught, and the way curators now approach their mandate for collecting and exhibiting works of art. I'd like to add my thanks to that of Virginia and others, to all of the participants in the symposium today, as well as the committee, the Photographs Council committee that conceived of this symposium, and also with great help from Virginia and Amanda Maddox, made it happen. They have given us this opportunity to stop and evaluate the condition of photography in Los Angeles in 2014, 175 years after its invention. Thank you.